Hello, everyone. We are 21 people and counting. That's great. My name's Sonia. I'm a consultant at HVFC International Focus on MEL, and I'll be your host for today together with my colleague Emily, and we'll be talking about designing great projects. So welcome, everyone. We're very happy to see so many of you here. And yeah, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about what makes a good project. We'll be talking about the elements and processes that you may want to consider when designing one. And we'll also have time to discuss some of the challenges that you may have faced when designing your own projects. So yeah, over to Emily. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sonia. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Bango. I'm also a consultant with HVFC International, and I have a background in MEL. I am based in the United States, and yeah, we're really excited to talk to you today about project design. First, just a very brief introduction about HVFC. For those of you who aren't already familiar, of course, with us, we're an international development-focused consulting firm with offices in the Netherlands and the United States. Our consultants are from all over the world and have a range of different experiences and expertise. Our services include 3 interconnected pillars: fundraising, monitoring and evaluation and learning, as well as recruitment. And this webinar falls under our MEL pillar.
Yeah, our MEL pillar consists of services under each of the 3 categories. So we do monitoring work, we do evaluations, and we do learning. We provide technical assistance, we conduct evaluations, facilitate trainings, and develop monitoring frameworks and tools for clients to support generally improving their processes and helping them maximize their impact. This is the second webinar that we're doing of a series of free webinars to introduce the MEL pillar. The next one is coming up in 2 weeks and will be about data management and how we move into the 21st century and away from our spreadsheets. So that'll be fun. But today, so for this project design webinar, just some practical issues first. If you have any questions at any point whatsoever, please drop them in the chat, which should be at the bottom right corner of your screen. And we'll do our best to integrate your questions as we go along. And also, just for you to know, this webinar will afterwards be uploaded to YouTube, where you can watch any bits that you missed or didn't note down, or you can share it with friends and family. And all of your comments will be anonymized for that. So don't worry about writing anything and everything in here that can be helpful to other people on the webinar. So that's a lot about us. Now we would really love to learn something about you. So you will see a little poll pop up on your screen in a minute, and I absolutely love it if you quickly fill it out.
Yeah, and the webinars that we've done so far, it's been really amazing to see people call in from all different places in the world, and we're really excited to hear where y'all are from and the type of what brings you here today.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see a good deal of people with very varied profiles as well, which is great. It's brilliant to have people who are coming from more than one background so we can see different perspectives. Great, wait, how many of those I have? Okay. I'll give you like 30 more seconds. Oh, I think this is the very first poll we've done that has at least somebody on every option, which is exciting. Okay. Right. Okay. So here we are. Ta-da! So we have a good number of people from Europe and from North America. which is where HVFC has headquarters. So that's not surprising, but it's great to see there's a good number of people from Africa as well, and some Asia Pacific people. That's great. Lots of fundraising people. Hey, welcome. We are very happy to get to talk to fundraising people as Mel people. One of the main things about HVFC is that we do both, because we are of the conviction that these professions can gain a lot by just talking a little more to each other and understanding where each other is coming from. So it's brilliant to see you here. Some Melt people, yay. Program management, operations, communications, something else, and people who don't currently have an affiliation. Amazing. Welcome, all of you. And now to the topic. Loads of you, well, almost everybody who filled out the survey basically is often tasked with writing sections of a proposal. Great. Lots of you have done problem analysis. Quite a lot have done a theory of change, indicators, or budgets. Loads of you are coordinating with project stakeholders. Okay. And scouting for opportunities. Great. Okay, well, good to know that you're interested in the things we wanted to talk about anyways. So on to the next part of the course.
Thanks, Sonia. Yeah, really exciting to see folks from all different that have played all different roles in the project design and proposal drafting. We did previously, a couple of months ago, have a proposal writing webinar as well that you can find on our YouTube channel that was specific to fundraising focus. So we're excited to draw in the fundraising folks to be thinking a little bit further into the MEL perspective from project design during this webinar, and we think that they're really complementary. So the content of this course, it's all about project design for winning proposals, and we're going to discuss the following elements. We'll briefly look into problem analysis, problem goal, theory of change, objectives, activities, and developing a MEL plan. So we'll review all of the things that we believe make a strong proposal. So now that we've seen how the different roles that you all play within the NGO sector, we're actually going to start with a principle that comes from the private sector. I know the parallels are limited, but in a way, selling a product is a lot like bidding for a project. You have to convince the customer, which would be the donor, to invest in your version of a product or project rather than in another one. NGOs spend a lot of time and effort on marketing in the wider sense. In that case, I mean text, images, and specific references that make up the actual proposal document. That's just like advertisers who spend all of their time deciding on the font and wording for their Facebook ad. And yes, you can't sell a product or a project without paying some attention to those things. But the font and proposal wording are never the reason a customer or a donor makes the decision to invest in a project. They invest in it because they believe it's a good fit and that it's what they want in terms of to accomplish the goals that they have set out for that funding. So today we're going to talk about how to design a project that is of high quality and worth investing in.
Okay, so now we'll be looking at the pathway to good project design. But given that all of you have already said you're doing a lot of this already, I'm interested again in asking for your opinion on some of these elements. So there's another poll popping up on your screen. And I know with the first question, we're putting you on the spot and asking you something rather impossible. But of all the different elements of the proposal and project design, what do you end up focusing on quite a lot? What do you end up putting the most time and effort into? That would be great to know. And the second one would be around what do we struggle the most with in the organization that you work with, or the clients that you work with if you're not with an organization? Because then we can make sure we go into detail on the bits that you mention here. Interesting. I think the first one has a clear winner, but we'll see. That can always change. Okay, let's give it like 30 or so seconds more. Okay. Right, thanks everyone for participating in that. And so this is what this looks like. So everyone, well, no, lots of people, 37% of you, that's not everyone, 37% of you thought it was very important to put a lot of focus on a thorough problem analysis. Yes, that's really good to hear actually, because that tends to be what we see in a lot of clients as being yeah, a little bit the sort of neglected child. Everybody knows you're supposed to do it, but then actually putting the effort into and figuring out what that means for the project. It's great to see so many of you actually focus on that. And the activity work plan also has quite a bit of work on the second one, on struggling. It's interesting. The theory of change is the winner on things that are difficult. Totally agree. Figuring that out is always difficult. Some of you also think that problem analysis is difficult. Totally agree. Depends on where you get information from and what questions even to ask. And then we have a couple of people who think the budget and the MEL plan are definitely worth improving on in their organizations as well. Cool. Okay. So, great. We'll be talking about most of these elements today. So whether or not that was what you focused on, you'll be getting something out of today. We won't focus on risk registers or systems maps. I just threw them in there because they're quite commonly required. Well, systems maps are getting more and more popular now because they're better than log frames at showing complexities. But because they're still a bit of a niche idea, we won't focus on them today. You can definitely approach us about that though. Right, so let's dive right in. The first thing that you see on here is the problem analysis, and a lot of you already said that is what you consider very essential. Basically, it's in my view, it's what makes everything else easier. If you have a really good definition of what your problem is, who's facing it, and why, then making a theory of change and writing activities to do something about it actually gets so much easier. So problem analysis should be a description of the problem that should be including detailed and on-the-ground information that describes the exact challenges that your target community is facing and looks at individual as well as structural obstacles and other factors that you can get your hands on, essentially. It's useful to do some desk research on that, but to the donor, always make sure that you show your unique perspective and previous experience with the topic. It's useful to think of this at various levels and break down the information and the problem into different parts. One of the tools that I find quite helpful about that is asking why 5 times. So if, say, your problem is something around women are disadvantaged in the employment sector in this town or village that you're working with, then you ask why. So why are they disadvantaged? And then it might be something about either the educational chances, or it might be about discriminatory employers, or it might be about societal norms. And then you ask why 5 times, and then you will get to something that that sounds like something that is more of an underlying problem, so that you're not essentially putting bandages on the symptoms on top. Also worth thinking about with the resources that you have or will be applying for, which part of this problem can you tackle? It's probably unlikely that you're going to solve gender inequality in the entire labor market or generally in the village that you're working with just one project, right? So think about something that's reasonable. Maybe that's about generating opportunities or improving skills or something more on that scale, basically. Right, so once you have the problem settled, you can go and talk about your project goal. So the project goal is basically the sort of high-level vision. It's beyond what you can achieve with just that one project that you're designing. It's kind of what the ideal scenario would be, the opposite of the problem that you've just described. So for example, women have equal opportunities in the employment sector in this location. So it's definitely useful to use very clear and concise language around that. So it's better to say women have equal opportunities on the employment market than gender inequality doesn't exist anymore or something, because that's a lot harder to make any sense of and it will look different to everybody. So try and use very concise language, but be aware that this is probably not something that you can measure and fully achieve within the timeframes and with the means that you have to measure things during the time of your project.
Great, thank you, Sonia. And moving right along. So after you have established your problem that you are seeking to address with the project, and you have identified your project goal, which is how you will address overall that the problem that you have identified, you can move into the theory of change. And the theory of change defines the long-term goal or goals of the project and then maps backward to identify necessary preconditions in order to accomplish the goal. It's often an if-then statement with language that generally encompasses the activities and subsequent changes that will occur as a result of successfully implementing a project. To develop your project theory of change, consider the following questions. What's the overall goal? So you've just identified that, hopefully, in the step before. And what needs to change in order to achieve that goal? So thinking about the individuals, organizations, relationships, opportunities, what needs to happen in order to work towards that goal. And, we always talk about the fact that it's never just one thing, right? So recognizing that within a project, if you are working to address gender inequality in employment, that it wouldn't just be that that women need to have opportunities to apply for additional positions, but perhaps it would also have to do with other factors within society that would be affecting whether or not that they could apply for those positions or make their themselves available. So maybe that has to do with childcare, maybe that has to do with other responsibilities that they might have, professional development, things like that. So thinking about all those factors that might need to change in order to achieve the goal is a really important step. You can also think about what activities are necessary to achieve the objectives and who are the main actors and what type of support do they need. So thinking about, again, going back to the gender equality, we could talk about the women in a community that would be one of the main actors, but who else is involved in ensuring that they could potentially have more access to equal opportunities in employment. So for a theory of change in general, thinking about it as an if-then statement is helpful to creating if these things occur. So if we're able to accomplish these things, then the ultimate project goal will be able to be accomplished.
Okay, and from the theory of change, it should be relatively simple to define the specific objectives, which is what exactly is this project going to achieve. So within this entire universe of problems and factors that could then lead to our project goal, which you've defined in the theory of change, you'll pick one or two specific objectives which you can achieve with the means, the partnerships, and the money that you're applying for. So that, it's basically something between the big project goal that you'll achieve in a couple of years if everything goes well, and lots of other people also do something about gender equality, and your activities. So it's the bit in between that sort of shows the activities have been successful, you've changed something, and eventually that can lead to there being no gender inequality in the labor market or something. So think of them as the link between the activities and the project goal. And it's important for them to be SMART, so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, as much as possible. You can detail some of that always in the indicators and in the MEL plan, but the clearer it is from your objectives, what you're trying to achieve, the easier it will be to get your stakeholders on board with it, to make sure that there are no misunderstandings, and to get your donors to understand exactly what it is that you're doing, also what it isn't that you're doing, because you don't want to have sort of wrong expectations on either end when you're starting something like this. For example, for our gender equality project, that could be things like women have the required knowledge, skills, and confidence to be successful in the job market. That might be something that you could have as an objectives, or employers make explicit efforts to recruit more women. You'll see from these, I find it helpful to phrase objectives as an active sentence. So you start with the actor that you need to change something, and then you write what they are doing now that they didn't used to do at the beginning of your project. That is quite a useful way, I find, to sort of define objectives and make sure that they're concrete enough for you to actually work on them.
And once you have defined those objectives, now it's time to think about the specific activities underneath each objective that is going to contribute to that those objectives. So if you think about, if you have two objectives during the 4-year project, you will have activities underneath that will respond and contribute to achieving that objective. I think oftentimes it's really easy and to be thinking about activities first. So you see a notice of funding opportunity from a donor, or you're thinking about a concept, or you talk to partners about an activity or an idea that they might have, and you start with the activities right away. That is a really common thing that happens, and we are aware that that is how most projects start. So we really encourage you to at least not hold on to those activities as being something that have to be there after you've gone through the rest of the process. So you can have a couple of activities perhaps in mind, or something that your organization consistently does really well that you keep in mind as you go through defining the problem, establishing the project goal and the theory of change and the objectives, and then kind of look at all of that you've done so up to that point, and then think about what activities will actually help us to achieve those objectives. So this is often a really great thing to do with a group. So with your proposal development team, and they're designed to best lead to your objectives and goals. And it's important to continue to keep that in mind as you're talking about the activities. So as you describe them in the grant application, it's important to be really clear on their purpose and how they're linked. And giving details about also what it will look like practically. And I think particularly during this time with the pandemic, with everything that is happening, that makes things perhaps, it makes things a lot less certain about what activities could occur. It's really good to also include contingencies in that. So some important questions to ask are, what is the actual purpose of this activity? Why do we need it? How does it contribute to that objective? And how will it move the project closer to accomplishing what we want to accomplish within the overall project? So this clear link can also, if you have an idea that comes up within the activities that perhaps isn't involved or doesn't quite fit within the objectives you defined, that doesn't necessarily mean that you remove the activity completely, but you can think about perhaps that means that I need to adjust the objectives, or I need to adjust the project goal to ensure that that activity is fits in to the project. So you can see it as, of course, you want to make sure that that project goal is still addressing the problem. But if you know that one activity is going to be really valuable and it isn't quite reflected in the objective, then you can actually think about how you can make sure that it is and ensure that there's still those clear linkages. So it looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat. And I don't know, Sonia, is there anything that you would want to address verbally before we move forward into the budget?
Yeah, actually, that was a really great question around can you define an activity before identifying the key stakeholders? That's a really good point because we haven't really addressed stakeholders as a separate part of the process. Normally, you will see from your theory of change, and often already in your problem analysis, you will see who the people are that are important to whatever you're trying to address. But if this is a relatively small community that you're working with, and the factors that you've identified all belong to a good handful of stakeholders or organizations, whether that's, I don't know, the local businesses and schools, and then maybe, the target audience themselves, and that's kind of all you're dealing with, then you can go and look at activities. But it's definitely a good idea if you have the feeling that there are lots of actors involved. You may not know all of them very well, you may not have worked with them before, then doing an actor map where you're identifying not only who they are, but also what they want, how likely they are to work with you, to work towards the same objectives that you're trying to achieve, and how easy it might be to engage them. Because that will then make it easier to define activities that include the right actors, so that you're not getting disappointed with actors that you thought would work with you but then don't. So it's probably a good idea to be really clear on your stakeholders before going into activities. A really good question there. Thanks. Cool. So we'll quickly just talk about the last element in the process, which is the mail plan. So if you've gone through all of these steps, you've defined what the problem is, you've defined a theory of change to address it, you've gone through goals and objectives and stakeholders and activities, so you know what you're doing, then a mail plan is really just a document that helps you track whether what you're doing is achieving what you wanted to achieve. So normally a mail plan has indicators at various levels. So you will have some at the higher objective levels. Maybe in this case, that might be something about women applying to jobs and then women getting accepted for jobs or something of that kind. And then you can have indicators at lower levels, which talk about the number of people that you engaged in your activities and maybe how much they gained confidence or something of that kind. So you will essentially find indicators that track the bits in your theory of change that are important. And then once you have those, or probably while you're discussing them really, because that's usually where the discussion goes, how do we measure it? So if you've decided that what one key ingredient that's missing for the women in your community to have better chances on the labor market is confidence, then you're getting into the messy story of having to measure confidence. So on that one, essentially, you will then have to discuss data collection methods. There's probably going to be some level of survey or interviewing that you can do around that. It's always good to Google around those kinds of indicators, because chances are somebody out there has been thinking quite a lot about that and has found maybe a good survey question or something that you can just adapt for your project. Yes, and then another thing that you'll be thinking about in your mail plan is an evaluation. If it's big, has a lot of budget, runs over quite a long period of time, it's definitely a good idea to have a 10% budget in there that gives you space to run an external evaluation, so that you can have a consultant come in who hasn't been involved and put their lifeblood into the project, and who can then tell you what went well and what you can do better next time. If it's relatively small, an internal evaluation might be the better option for you if you have people on hand who can do that. And then another key part of the MEL plan, the L in MEL, often very neglected, is the learning. So that is just, it's useful to think upfront of how you will feed back things that you find through your indicators and your monitoring, and maybe if you do mini evaluations in between, it's useful to think about how they will feed back. So for example, projects are sometimes designed in a way that, they have 1 year work plan first, and then there's a bit of an assessment, and then you may end up pivoting a little bit, maybe working with other people in year 2 or something. So find a way of having an idea up front of how you will look at the key factors that are important to you, maybe the key parts of your theory of change that you're not sure of. And then set meetings in the calendar where you as a team can look at the data you have, figure out, is this what we expected to see, or do we need to pivot? And then you find ways of integrating that into your project plan going forward. Of course, that always has It depends a lot on the donors at that point, because there are definitely donors who don't like it at all if you change a project plan after it's been approved. So that might be a bit more difficult, but more and more donors, I think, are moving towards a realization that it's hard to define a project upfront and be right about everything and be able to implement everything. COVID should have shown everybody that nobody has any way of predicting what they can and can't implement. So hopefully that will be a conversation that will be easier and easier to have. Last thing about MEL plans, make sure there's a little budget attached to tasks in your MEL plan that could need it. So if you want to run a huge survey that, I don't know, checks how some attitude has improved maybe among your target community, that'll need some money. So make sure it's in there before you start, so that you don't get to the end of the project, want to run your big end of your survey, and then don't have the budget for it. Okay, so now we've talked a lot at you and kind of taken you through a whole MEL tour of designing projects. Now, what we'd be really interested in is any questions or problems you faced when designing projects, either along the process that we've shown you, or in whichever version that looks like in your organization. So what challenges have you faced? And yeah, then we can see what we can say about that. So there's one question already. Is MEL similar to log frame? You mean a MEL plan probably, right? Yes, in a lot of cases that looks very similar. I'd say the main difference is that a MEL plan takes into account how you will practically go about filling that. So as I mentioned, it talks about the data collection methods. Usually it assigns that to somebody. So it's someone's job to make sure there's a number in that log frame box. And it's more of a sort of operational plan than just a theoretical construct of how your project is going to work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and we didn't specifically address the logical framework today, but there are plenty of resources out there if your donor requires it. We also just generally encourage thinking about the logic of the project. You can usually fit that in right after you develop your theory of change. And we're seeing here too, there's a question about the theory of change and the logical frameworks and how they differ. So the theory of change is a bit broader of a description. So you're thinking about, and I can actually pull up the slide again, defining those long-term goals of a project and then mapping backward to identify the necessary preconditions. So you're thinking about, okay, this is the overall project goal we want to have, and these are the things that we need to achieve in order to get there. And within the logical framework, you are going to get much more detailed. So within the logical framework, you'll talk about first the problem again, and that is identified in needs. So what do these communities need in order to achieve this overall project or this overall goal? So in the case of equality in employment, that those could be things like training on different expertise, or training on your developing a CV or a resume, job searching opportunities. You could think about other stakeholders that might have needs within that to understand what inequality looks like in employment at that moment. Your inputs would be what you are going to bring to the table, whether that's training materials, staff time, funding, all of those would be included in your inputs. And then you think about the activities, you define those. And then with each activity, you think about what is going to be the product of that activity, which would be considered an output. And then you can think about, okay, after that activity, after we have the product, what do we hope to see after that activity has occurred? And then you'll find your outcomes, and that'll all lead to your impact. So a logical framework really breaks down every single specific activity that you are defining, and it supports then kind of going through that whole path with you. So you go through the journey of the whole project as a plan for your logical framework. The theory of change supports that by talking about the high level, this is what we overall want to achieve, and these are the small achievements that we need in order to get there. Looks like we have another question too, Sonia.
Looks like we have another question. We've got two, yeah. So there's one, yeah. Oh man, haven't we all been there? When you're struggling to meet a donor deadline and don't think you can realistically prioritize all of these areas of program design, which areas would you consider to be absolutely essential? Yeah, I totally hear you. That's totally a reality. I think, and we might defer on that, Emily. I think for me it would probably be a sort of theory of change logic, which I mean might look more like a log frame because I tend to drill my program management people to actually really go into detail on those. But yeah, to have the logic that goes from this is what we want to do this is what we want to see in the end, we were going to do this and this is how we think this leads to it. That's the main part, I think, without which it's going to be really hard to write anything that's convincing. But I don't know, Emily, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that sometimes the theory of change feels so intimidating, even just with some of the language that might exist if you like Google it, if you're looking it up online. But when you are sitting down to prepare a proposal with the proposal team, you are actually defining that. Sometimes it just comes down to capturing it in a more clear way or in a way that the donor can understand. But certainly, the theory of change, I would say, is the thing that you want to make sure you have prioritized, because that helps to tie all of the rest of the project to get together. So yeah, I'm looking at the question again to just make sure. Yeah, because I think if you have identified, if you're able to articulate your theory of change, and what you want to achieve, and then your activity should more or less really fall into place, because they will be, if as long as you're just thinking through the activities, okay, does this tie in? How does this relate to our theory of change? That should come a little bit easier. You of course want to also describe in detail what those activities will do. So basically how you're going to be using the funds. But I see that the theory of change really helping to keep those activities all aligned. And I'm seeing too here another challenge that was noted was the development of the performance indicator reference sheets. Which so that is basically a lot of donors are requiring at this point for each indicator that you identify for your project, that you have a performance indicator reference sheet that provides details about the definition, how frequently you're going to collect the data, what methods you're going to use to actually collect it. Yeah, and it does. And the comment basically is that it does take quite a lot of time. And that is very true. I think one of the things that I talk to our clients a lot about when we're developing peers is that if you think about it, like you are developing and you've defined this indicator, and then over the course of a 2 or 3 year project, someone else is likely going to need to collect that data. So say you have something simple like number of trainings that are administered by the project. It's likely that you might have different types of trainings that occur. You might have trainings for state employers, local businesses in a community, and you might have trainings for women that are interested in new employment. That if you haven't defined what types of trainings are going to occur within the project in the indicator definition, then somebody new that's coming in that might be there in the local community that has been tasked with responding to this indicator, they might not have a very good idea about what constitutes a training. So I really look at it as, particularly for the peers, to really focus on the definition of it, and what would be included in that indicator as you're tracking it over time. Because there's often a likelihood that the person that is addressing that indicator or collecting data for that indicator isn't the same person that has drafted the proposal. I think the other point that I think I like to emphasize is that the definition doesn't have to remain exactly the same in the proposal as when you actually start implementing. So don't be afraid at that point to make changes to the performance indicator reference sheets as you actually start implementing. Of course, you want to make sure that the donor is comfortable with that, but those things often occur. So I think if you're thinking about a participatory manner, and if there are a lot of people that are involved in describing and defining, how what this indicator is defined as, and how to track it, you can make sure to encourage everyone to embrace the fact that changes can occur. So making it as simple as possible up front. And then allowing for that expansion or contraction of the definition and of when you're collecting that information, depending on how the project actually starts to be implemented.
Oh, we've been asked to show a sample indicator reference sheet, just the main headings. We can definitely share one afterwards. I don't have one immediately to hand, but unless you do, Emily, I don't know. But we can definitely make sure we can send you one in the follow-up to this webinar. Then we have a question here that's on, could you comment on what aspects of this process are best driven by fundraisers versus service designers? I.e., if there are multiple people developing the service, which stages of the pathway could or should be led by fundraisers? That's a really good point. I guess it'll depend a lot on how generally, the structures in your organization are, how busy people are at the time that you need to do the proposal, but also how people even perceive their own roles, including those with the donor. In some of the proposal design processes I've been part of that have worked the best, we had the fundraising person in the room for all crucial meetings so that they always knew broadly where we were going, but they weren't in charge of leading any of it, if that makes sense. So we had the fundraising person around because she basically knew best what the donors' priorities were, what kinds of things they liked and didn't like to see in proposals. So when we were going in a direction where we had loads and loads of objectives, they were saying, no, this donor really doesn't like that. You need to narrow it down. So that all made sense, but they weren't in charge of leading it, because usually, as you were probably saying there as well, they are not the people with most subject expertise, right? It's the service designers or the people that are then in charge of implementing the project. Ideally, even I would say, if you can get beneficiaries into any of these early phases, problem design or theory of change, that's the gold standard. That's sometimes not possible, but the closer people are to the problem that this project is trying to solve, the better it is for them to have a lot of input in the beginning. Now, in terms of leading, I think there's sort of two things that are worth keeping separate. One is having the most input and basically providing most of the content, and one is facilitating it. It's useful to have someone facilitating who isn't actually that closely involved. So in some of the process I've seen that worked well, that was either then a fundraiser or a MEL person or someone higher up in management who had an interest in the whole thing working out well, but who didn't know the sort of nitty-gritty and didn't have the relationships on the ground. So you can make sure that the person who has all that knowledge about the problem and the people involved, that person can provide most of the input, and is just being invited essentially and probed with the right questions, so that they don't need to worry about making it fit into this kind of very rigid framework around log frames and theories of change and indicators. They just need to worry about making sure all the relevant elements, all the bits that they know about this project are being talked about, if that makes sense. So that's probably one way I would go about it.
Yeah, just adding to what Sonia mentioned, I think that fundraisers should certainly be involved in the reflection sessions and planning stages of that. So I think it also depends on how your organization approaches your process for project design. And ensuring that the individuals that are drafting the proposal aren't the only people that are in the room when those discussions occur, and making sure to continue checking in depending on the time frame that you have. Also, just to mention, we do have an example performance indicator reference sheet that we can send, and we can also send a sample logical framework if you're interested in that too. I'm going to be honest, I can't quite figure out how to share something that is not our original presentation without losing the presentation. So I think it'll probably be best if we can send that to you afterwards, but it will be on its way. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have more questions? Otherwise, we can do a quick peek at one element which often gets a little overlooked during design, but is totally worth thinking about from the beginning. And that is adaptation, because people tend to think of project design as something that you do once and then you're done with it, so you implement. In reality, of course, it doesn't really work like that, because who's ever been on a project that's been designed one way and everything just worked out exactly the way that you had it, right? Never heard of it, to be honest. At least not anything that was longer than 3 weeks, say, because something always happens that you had no way of knowing when you designed it. Maybe something drastic changed in your context. Maybe, there was a global pandemic, or maybe some of the stakeholders that you had planned on working with couldn't be brought on board for whatever reason at that time. So it's useful to think of project design as something that is to an extent always ongoing. Of course, the broad, the goal, the objectives, and the broad idea of how you're going to go about it, you're going to largely fix that in the beginning. But if you then, for example, learn something new about your problem, then it makes sense to reassess parts of the theory of change that were kind of anchored in that bit of the problem. There's this way of visualizing it. There's lots of different ways that people explain adaptation, but for me, it's basically just going through the implementation phase of your project while having regular points at which you ask, are we seeing the kinds of things that we expected at this stage? Are we seeing other things that we thought were completely unrelated, but we need to consider? And if either of those two things are not as we expect, then what can we or do we need to do differently? And just having essentially a regular reflection around that. Emily's had some practical experience getting that done in organizations, I think.
Yeah, certainly. I think that, and this kind of is also a nod to fundraisers and program managers too, because a lot of this this ability to have moments of reflection and what I would consider evaluation moments throughout the project and then presenting is another point of that, is communicating those things to the donor. So making sure that there is I think it's very, very beneficial to have a great relationship with your donor, for the donor to understand a bit that realistically, this is what's going to happen throughout the life of the project. And as we've designed something based on the best knowledge that we had, our contacts that are operating within that community, our partner organizations, getting everybody involved up front, but that over the course of the project, things are going to change. And as they change, we are also going to be able to shift we're going to know, first of all, that things are changing, and the level of effectiveness that our original activities have based on our monitoring. And then we are going to have taken the time to reflect on that and figure out what solutions that we can adapt to ensure that that our project enhances, at least continues to have be effective, but also potentially enhances that effectiveness as we learn to adapt. So that, I think, as an implementing organization, it's really important to keep that in mind during project design, and to start to factor in some of that language throughout the proposal, so the donor can expect that you are going to be that responsive to changes that are happening on the ground. So I think that is it's just it's an important conversation to continue to have with your donor. Yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to mention too, I think it was brought up in one of the original polls about budgeting. So we only have just a few minutes left, but to address, Sonia mentioned it briefly with the MEL plan about thinking about how much budget you will need for your monitoring and evaluation activities that occur, even staff time when thinking about the thinking about the activities that you are implementing, and then how much time it might take to develop a survey, to administer a pre and post training survey, for example, to think about if you want to hold focus groups or perhaps even interview some participants in an activity. Things can also be way less formal. You can be soliciting feedback during coffee breaks or or after when you see somebody at another event. But it is really good to think about that staff time that you'll be using to actually monitor the project. And the budget also obviously comes into play when you're thinking about the activities as well. So just super briefly, we can talk for just a few short minutes about the budget. And that often, we found working with clients, and this is very common with organizations that are more than just a couple of people, that the person that's responsible for crafting the budget is not really very involved in the rest of the project design or proposal development. Usually it's a finance person that, or your accountant that is responsible for drafting that budget, or at least approving it. So a couple of the things that you can do when you are as the proposal developer, or the team of individuals that are developing and designing the proposal, is to think about how much things are going to cost, and to keep that in mind as you are developing the activities based on the notice of funding opportunity, or however way the donor has communicated how much funding that you have available for this work. And you really also want to make sure that those budget costs are aligned with the activities, and they detail each planned activity, how much equipment, travel, personnel will be needed for it. And that you still factor in those monitoring and evaluation activities within that. We find frequently that it's a concept almost of managing up, that the donor might not necessarily know how much time it might take to implement this activity efficiently or appropriately. So it is up to us to be able to provide enough detail so the donor really is able to see just how much how much time and energy and material something will take.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, we had one more question, and I really don't want to leave it unaddressed. That's a really good point over here. So project beneficiaries may not always have flexibility for adaptation, even in unexpected situations. For example, during the COVID-19, to postpone implementation or changing the objective of the initial design. Yes, that's true. And the best way of dealing with those kinds of things will depend very, very heavily on, the specific people you're dealing with, what kind of relationship you have with them. If it's a relatively small group that interacts quite regularly with your services, then there may be ways that you can manage this. It'll be harder in a way because they expect more of you. They are used to going to you for certain services, and then if certain restrictions don't allow you to practice those, I'm massively assuming here, then that's of course harder to do. I don't think we can necessarily give you any tips on that, because you are probably the person that knows best because you've been dealing with that. What I would always say is most people, both within organizations and at donor level, and of course the beneficiaries, tend to completely understand if what you're saying is, we know we need to do X and Y because of COVID. Our donor wants us to do Z. Our beneficiaries say A, B, and C. We're going to do A, B, and C. If you have in any ways the means to do that, most donors will find a way of, most donors can be convinced, I think, to do things that you need to do because your beneficiaries have either actively asked for it, or you know that this is something they're facing because of the change in situation. And as long as you can keep that integrity within your organization and towards donors, I think that should be a way that you can sustain your services, even if you have to adapt them in one way or another. It's a very generic, probably not very helpful answer, but yeah.
Yeah, I would say, just adding to Sonia's response, that I think, often with donors, changing the objectives can be a really big deal, and that might be something that they might be more adamant that they want to keep in a specific, for a specific project, oftentimes based on what their priorities are for that particular funding. So we think that really, if something like that necessitates such a big change, it's providing as much detail as possible about why. And we always say too, to come up with the solution that you've already, so instead of just presenting them with a problem, okay, so, um, we're not going to be able to accomplish this objective the way that we initially planned. And that being the starting point for the conversation. Actually having that, we're not going to be able to accomplish the objective the way that we planned. This is the way that we are now planning to accomplish that objective, or this is the way that we need this objective to be changed, and these are the reasons why. So including all of that justification, which often comes from monitoring, so often comes from that data that you're collecting on the ground about the implementation of activities and working with your partners. I think that often, if you work for an international NGO, you may be a bit further from the actual activities that are occurring in the local communities that you are working in. So your role can be a bit like a translator for donor language or donor speak, and the language that the community is using to justify why some changes need to occur. And working to be that intermediary is a really valuable role that you can play. So figuring that out. I'm leaving the top tips up here. We have just about a minute or two left, but I see that we have another question, so we'll try to answer that really quickly.
Yeah, great question. Generating and identifying lessons in project implementations. I'm not aware of any sort of standard tools you can use, but it's generally a good idea to bring the relevant people that were involved with the project implementation, bring them all in a room or in a virtual room at the moment. You make sure that this is the only thing on the agenda, because otherwise it'll get eaten up by other things. And then you first talk about the things that they felt went really well. So this is not necessarily related to objectives that you may have to find in your log frame or somewhere else, but things that the people implementing the project felt were going really well, and then you ask them why, and then you do the same thing with things that they felt were not going very well and ask them why. Often what will have happened already, if that project has been running for a while and it may even be over, then things will have happened and they will have already adapted and done something else. So what is another question useful to ask is, what did you change about your original plans during the project, and why? And was that helpful, in what way? So these are the kinds of questions I tend to ask, but I don't really have any standard tools for that. Don't know if Emily has.
My most standard tool is called a reflection session. So basically the questions that Sonia asked, and really planning for those periods. So whether that is once every 2 weeks, once a month, once a quarter, however frequency that you find is plausible for your organization and for the project. I think that often we are just running around addressing different different problems or obstacles, or getting contracts done, or all of these things that make fill up our days working at NGO, and that it's sometimes hard to factor in the time for actual reflection, to think about those lessons. So and it takes practice. It's like a muscle that you might not be using that frequently, that you need to sort of repeat and use as much as possible to get that practice in. So encourage you to, even if you have 10 minutes to think about some of those questions. What went well, what hasn't gone well, why hasn't it gone well, and why has it gone well, and thinking about that, and just making that a very common phrase, common questions that you're consistently asking throughout implementation, is a really great way to do that. And you can integrate that into other program meetings if you have to, but we really encourage those to be very specific meetings for that. Yeah, so we have, it's been really amazing to see so many questions and to get to address this. This is our ideal for a webinar, is to have this type of interaction. So thank you all so much for tuning in and for contributing. Leaving our email addresses up here. You'll also receive an email likely at the end of this week or early next week with those materials that we discussed, as well as with our email addresses, in case you want to talk to us any more about any specific questions. We are here and would love to continue these conversations. Just a question about the webinar. It'll be up on YouTube in the next couple of days, so you'll get to see the recording of that if you missed it.
Okay, everyone, thanks very much and have a great rest of your day.